I'm Norah O'Donnell. Thanks for joining us on CBSNews.com or on the CBS News app. Joining us now is Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the NIH. Dr. Fauci, good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you, Norah.
This is an extended conversation, and some viewers have written in questions as well, and we'll get to those in a minute. But first, let me ask you, Dr. Fauci, 37 states, that is nearly 3/4 of the country, is seeing an increase in daily cases. Why is the United States headed in the wrong direction?
Well, I mean, what's happening is that we were in a difficult place to begin with, Norah. As you know, the background baseline number of cases that we were having each day was between 45 and 50,000 a day. That's an unacceptably high level. And then what's happening in some of the Midwest state and the Northwest, and even now in the upper Northeast corridor, as the weather gets cooler in the fall, you're seeing people doing things more indoors than outdoors, which is always a bad situation to be in when you're dealing with a respiratory infection. So what we're seeing, unfortunately, is upticks in case positivities, test positivities. That's going to translate, as it already is, into additional hospitalizations, which ultimately are going to translate into additional deaths. So we have a high background to begin with, and now we're starting to see, as you said correctly, an uptick in cases, in 37 states. I mean, that is a substantial proportion of the United States of America. That is not a good sign as you're entering into the cooler weather. So what we really have to do is double down on the things that I talk about every single day, the 5 issues: universal wearing of masks, keeping a distance, avoiding crowds in congregate settings, trying to do things outdoors, preferentially over indoors, and washing your hands frequently. They sound very simple, but people are not doing that. And that's the reason why we're seeing the uptick in cases.
You've said we could have up to 400,000 deaths by the end of the year because of a deadly fall and winter. How many lives could be saved if everyone wore masks?
I think a substantial proportion of that projection could have been whittled away at, Norah, if we use masks and did physical distancing and avoid congregate settings. It's very clear that when people do things in crowds without masks, particularly if you're indoors, it's just asking for trouble, because we know without a doubt that those are the kind of events that have spreading among people. It isn't as if we haven't been there before. We know that's trouble. So it just seems so obvious we've got to avoid that.
Mm-hmm. NBC News has just announced that they're going to be hosting a town hall tomorrow night with President Trump. That is 10 days after he was discharged from the hospital. Is that event safe?
Well, I would hope that people would be wearing masks. I hope that they're physically separated enough from each other. I hope there's good ventilation in the room so that you don't have the recirculation of air that might have a virus in it. I think when you have an event like that, you've got to make sure that you dot all the I's and cross all the T's of public health recommendations.
But NBC says that you signed off on the president's participation. Is that correct?
That is correct. I was asked by the White House to take a look at all of the totality of the COVID-related tests that he undertook, as well as to do one of the tests at the NIH in our own laboratories. And I and one of my colleagues who's very experienced in this, Dr. Cliff Lane, came to the conclusion, I think certainly correctly, that he is of no threat to transmit the virus to anybody else.
So that he is not shedding infectious virus, as was said in
Correct.
the letter. But what about the people around him? What about the staff, Secret Service? I mean, as you know, presidents don't travel alone. They have a big contingent that travels with them.
Well, I can't address what's going on with them. The only statement that we made is that people were asking, is the president putting other people in danger because he had been infected? And the answer to that is no, he is not. I can't vouch for anybody else that's there, whether they've been tested or whether they've been careful in their interactions with people.
Would you attend it?
I don't attend gatherings that are congregate gatherings, Nora. That's just a policy that I make. I am in a risk category because of my age, and I don't think that that's prudent for me to do that. So I limit my interactions. I can do the job that I have by doing what you and I are doing right now.
Let me ask you about these large-scale events. 10,000 people will reportedly attend President Trump's rally tonight in an airport hangar in Des Moines, Iowa. Do you consider that type of event dangerous?
Nora, I have said it over and over again because, people understandably want me to specifically address what the president does or does not do. That's always difficult. I think when I make a general statement, it does answer the question you're asking. And that when you have congregate settings, when people are close to each other and you don't have virtually everyone wearing a mask, that is a risky situation that could very well lead to the kind of spreader events that we have seen in similar settings.
10,000 people in an airport hangar. How is that safe?
Well, like I said, when you have people gathered together in a space, even when it's partially open, the fact is that the way this virus is spread, that's a very large congregation of people. And when I look at photographs that I see, you can see that in so many respects, many of them are not wearing masks. That is a risk, and that is a potential problem.
You have said that holding these rallies by the president is, quote unquote, asking for trouble. After that, the president attacked you, and he said your pitching arm is far more accurate than your prognostications.
Well, I wouldn't argue with the president on that. My pitching arm is terrible, Nora. So the president and I are agreeing on something here.
Well, yeah, except he says that your pitching arm is more accurate than your prognostications, which suggests that you've been wrong in your prognostications.
Well, I think that the data have proven me to be correct.
And that's what?
And that is that when you get people congregating together without masks, that the risk is high, and outbreaks in those settings have proven that the risk is high.
Let me ask you about something the president said in his rally in Pennsylvania on Tuesday. He talked about Regeneron, which, of course, is that not yet approved monoclonal antibody, experimental, that he was able to receive. He said the government is going to be giving that antibody treatment to everyone because, quote unquote, that sucker works. He said it's going to be distributed all over the country to hospitals. Is there a plan for that?
Well, I think logistically, Nora, that is going to be difficult to do because the number of doses that are currently available is not going to be able to meet that projected benchmark. I think we're talking about hundreds of thousands of doses and not tens of millions of doses. So right now, given the supply that there is, I don't think we'll be able to attain that goal. Ultimately, if it gets approved for use, I would imagine the company is going to mass produce it and make it widely available. But right now, there are not enough doses to do that.
And let me ask you about a vaccine. The president also said there will be 100 million doses of the vaccine by the end of the year. Is that number accurate?
Vaccine that is from a company whose candidate has been proven to be safe and effective is different than saying that there's vaccine to that amount available, because when the government made the investment among 6 separate companies to produce doses of vaccine, there will be hundreds of millions of doses available. But available to use in a person would mean that that vaccine would have to have been proven to be safe and effective. And right now, there are a couple of candidates that are probably in a position that we will know by November or December whether or not they have a safe and effective candidate. If they do, there are only a few million doses of those vaccines that would be available. When you take the totality of all the companies that number of 100 million doses is correct. But when you say, is it available of a vaccine that is proven to be safe and effective, it's not going to be 100 million doses.
And so to just clarify that, when will there be a vaccine for the general population, for most Americans?
Yeah, that will likely be within the first quarter of 2021, by, let's say, April of 2021. But that would be predicated on the fact that all of the vaccines that are in clinical trials have proven to be safe and effective, because we've made an estimate to have about 700 million doses by the end of April. But that means from all 6 companies that we're making investments in. So that means that all 6 of those candidates have to have a vaccine that is proven to be safe and effective. And as I mentioned, that likely will be somewhere in the middle and end of April.
Let me ask you, on the campaign trail, we've seen former Vice President Joe Biden wearing 2 masks. What do 2 masks do? Does that protect someone more than wearing 1 mask?
You know, I don't know if I can say that as a fact, Nora. You know, you could always say 2 is better than 1. You know, the lining of 2 is twice as thick as the lining of 1. But I don't think, at least to my knowledge, no one has ever done a test to show the difference between 1 versus 2. But, you know, sometimes when you want to be extra safe, yeah, you put an extra mask on.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn to that Rose Garden event that you have called a super spreader event. We just learned that the daughter-in-law of the late Antonin Scalia has tested positive. How does someone test positive 17 days after an event? Is that possible?
You know, it's possible, but very unlikely. You know, the incubation period for the virus transmission is between 2 and 14 days, with a median of 5. There are always outliers of that. What could have happened is that she could have been, and again, I'm merely surmising, that the original event that infected someone was in that rose garden. She then could have been socially in contact with that person several days after the Rose Garden event and gotten infected then, which would make for the multiple day difference.
Right. Well, I'm no epidemiologist or contact tracer, but all you have to do is look at the pictures, and her name is Trish Scalia. She's actually sitting next to Kellyanne Conway and right behind Melania Trump. I mean, in those first 2 rows where a number of the people tested positive. So is there, Dr. Gottlieb, who used to run the FDA, said that he expected to see 3rd generation spread from that Rose Garden event. Explain what that means.
Yeah, 3rd generation spread would, let's say that I am in contact with you and I'm infected and I infect you. Then you go home and you infect Jeff. That's 2nd generation spread. Jeff goes to the restaurant and infects one of his workers. That's 3rd generation spread.
And that's why contact tracing is so important, right? Because you want to stop it immediately so that someone's not an asymptomatic spreader. So it's our understanding that the White House turned down CDC help to contact trace people at the White House. Why would they do that? And how dangerous is that if you don't trace the contacts that people have? You then can have these concentric circles of spreading.
You know, Nora, I really had no information about what they did. I can't comment on what they did or why they did that, because I was not involved in that decision making.
Let me ask you about your relationship with President Trump. When was the last time you spoke with him?
Last week.
And were you giving him advice or checking in, or can we ask about your conversation?
No, I'm sorry, Nora. You can't ask about the conversation I had with the President of the United States.
Well, I guess I can ask. You can refuse to answer, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Sorry.
What about the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden? Have you spoken with him?
No, I have not.
Okay. Let me ask you about something recently we just heard from the CDC director. He just put out that they are concerned that Thanksgiving gatherings could send coronavirus cases soaring. Do you agree with that?
Oh, I do. I do. And that's really an unfortunate fact that is going to cause, obviously, some concern about everyone who looks forward to the holidays and interacting with family members that they haven't seen in a while. That is unfortunately a risk when you have people coming from out of town, gathering together in an indoor setting. You don't know what the status of it is. It is unfortunate because that's such a sacred part of American tradition, the family gathering around Thanksgiving. But that is a risk.
So what is your advice about Thanksgiving?
I think given the fluid and dynamic nature of what's going on right now in the spread and the uptick of infections, I think people should be very careful and prudent about social gatherings, particularly when members of the family might be at a risk because of their age or their underlying condition. Namely, you may have to bite the bullet and sacrifice that social gathering unless you're pretty certain that the people that you're dealing with are not infected. Either they've been very recently tested or they're living a lifestyle in which they don't have any interaction with anybody except you and your family. Then it's okay. I mean, it's almost like my relationship with my wife. We almost do nothing with anybody else except each other. So I'm not worried about my infecting my wife or my wife infecting me. You take my sister and my brother-in-law, they're the same thing. They almost never go anyway socially of being in contact with other people. You would say that that kind of a gathering would be really relatively safe. But when you're talking about relatives that are getting on a plane, being exposed in an airport, being exposed in a plane, then walk in the door and say, Happy Thanksgiving, that you have to be careful about.
Yeah. So your Thanksgiving will look different this year?
My Thanksgiving is going to look very different this year. I would love to have it with my children, but my children are in 3 separate states throughout the country. And in order for them to get here, they would all have to go to an airport, get on a plane, travel with public transportation. They themselves, because of their concern for me and my age, have decided they're not going to come home for Thanksgiving, even though all 3 of them want very much to come home for Thanksgiving.
Nearly 30 million children nationwide are physically back in the classroom, at least for part of the week and for some in-person learning. Has this led to some of the outbreaks that were feared, or has the data showed that it's been relatively safe?
You know, I think it's going to really depend on where you are. For the most part, there has not been an indication that children are massively spreading the virus in community. I'm sure that there is going to be some indication that might happen, but we're not seeing that as a really major issue right now.
So can you please advise my children's school it's safe for them to go back?
All right, have them give me a call. You have my cell phone.
I guess this is the question, because many parents still are concerned. For the most part, is it safe for children to return to school? And what concerns you?
Well, again, that's a different question, Nora. And the way I answered that is a little bit different than what I just answered before. There really is not one size fits all. I think the default position should be, you should try as best as you can to do everything you can to get the children back to school. But things are different. If you live in a green or a dark green zone, getting the kids back, and that's a zone that has a very low test positivity, then you really can do that with relative impunity as long as you have a plan of what to do when a child gets infected. If you are in a yellow zone where there is some activity, you want to maybe modify things, have mask wearing, maybe some separation of desks, making sure there's good ventilation in schools. If you have a red zone where there's a high degree of infection, you really got to be very careful and look at the risk benefit of whether it is safe to open the schools rather than say, oh, send them in, let them get infected. So I think we have to look at it as one size does not fit all. And when you do open the schools, which we try very hard to do wherever we are, take a look at the CDC guidelines and recommendations about how to make school openings safe.
We're going to get to some viewer questions in a minute because I know people have texted me, so I'll let them know that that's coming. But first, the race for a vaccine. This week, we learned that Johnson & Johnson paused their vaccine trial for an unexplained illness. Do you know what happened?
No, I don't. And that should be kept confidential. But I think that's a good indication of the response to people who are worried about safety. You may say, well, wait a minute, that's paradoxical. We have a serious event. The fact is, when those things occurred, we jump all over that. We want to find out what the reason is. It associated with the vaccine? And if not, and if we don't know, we alert all the sites to be extra special alert to something that resembles that again. Because if it happens a second or a third time, then you got a real problem. So I think this is a manifestation of why we do pay attention to safety.
There is no approved cure for coronavirus. You've said there's not going to be a vaccine for the general public until at least April of next year. But the President of the United States is 74 and is clinically obese and was able to return home from the hospital in 3 days and is back out on the campaign trail. When people say the president beat it, I'm not worried about it. What's your response?
You know, that's sort of like saying somebody was speeding in a car at 95 miles an hour and didn't get in an accident, so I can go ahead and speed and not get in an accident. There's a great deal of variability. We're very, very pleased that the president did so well when he was infected with coronavirus. But there are also a lot of people who are his age and his weight, which did not do as well as the president did. The president was fortunate. He obviously has a good constitution. He did quite well, and I hope and I believe he will continue to do very well. But you can't take an N equals 1 and say, okay, then everybody who's in that category is going to do well. That's not so.
All right, let's turn now to some of the community questions that we got, people who texted me. One of our viewers texted me this. Michael, he's from Indianapolis, asks, what grade would you give the administration for the efforts to fight coronavirus?
You know, I'm not in a position to do that, Nora. I'd have to take a pass on that. I mean, I'm part of the coronavirus task force. You don't know how things would have worked out. I think it's a good thing maybe when this is all over to take a good post-mortem look at it and see if you can rate it and compare it to others.
Well,
but
let me follow it up with this. Where's the national strategy? Does it exist?
Well, not to the extent where people who say, show me a specific strategy. There is a strategic approach towards it, but obviously it's been criticized by many people as not being a centrally mandated strategy. I think one of the things we have to do is be humble enough and modest enough to look at the data and say we have 214,000 deaths and 7.7 million infections. Okay. We got to do better than that.
Okay, we got a number of questions about this. John asks, what about being reinfected with coronavirus? How common is that?
We don't know how common it is, Nora, but we do know that it occurs. We heard anecdotal stories about it, but now more and more cases are coming in that unquestionably are reinfection because you've proven that the virus that they've gotten infected with the second time is molecularly different than the virus that they were infected with the first time. So we know absolutely for certain it occurs. We just don't know how common it is yet.
Mm-hmm. One of our viewers, Kathleen from Locust Grove, Virginia, says, since cold weather will be here in a few weeks, are there any extra things we can be doing inside to help keep our families safe and well?
Yeah, I mean, you can. You make sure there's good ventilation. I mean, you may need to expend a little bit more heat energy to keep your house warm, but try and keep windows open. try and keep things well ventilated. And don't be afraid to wear a mask in your house if you're not certain of the persons that are in the house are negative. I think there's an interesting reports that we're getting. Dr. Birx is out in the field now doing an amazing job of traveling to different states, trying to get a feel for what's going on and telling people what to do. And she reports back to me literally yesterday that what she's seeing is that household transmission now is assuming a greater element of the transmissibility. So people who feel comfortable, they say, well, I'm in my own house with my own family. I don't need to wear a mask and I can just be, not be as careful as I would on the outside. And that's where the transmissibility is occurring. So we better be careful. Don't assume because you're in your own home with your own family that you're not going to spread infection, because you may feel perfectly well. And when you were outside speaking with someone who felt perfectly well, that they transmitted the virus to you. And then you're in danger of transmitting it to your family.
The presidential election is less than 3 weeks away. We've already seen long lines, people out early voting. So one of our viewers texted us, Abby from Chicago asked, what's your advice for voting and staying safe?
Well, I have seen in so many stores, Norah, I mean, you can try to get a cup of coffee in Starbucks and they say, stay here, you're 6 feet away from the next block. You don't move to the next block until that person moves on. Then you see the people in a particular establishment all wearing masks, some wearing gloves. If the voting stations are doing that, I think it's just as safe to vote as it is to go and get a cup of coffee in a Starbucks in which everyone's wearing a mask and doing the things they should be doing. So voting can be safe in person. There are some people clearly who are concerned, the elderly, people with underlying conditions. They don't want to get out of the house. They don't want to do that. Then, therefore, write-in voting and sending in ballots are perfectly fine for them, whatever suits you and your level of risk.
Have you voted by mail?
I haven't voted yet. What I'll likely do is either drop something off in the box or walk into the school where they have it and vote in person. Not sure yet. It depends on my schedule and how people like you keep calling me up and asking me to do things.
Well, I managed to vote by mail already. As you know, it just comes right in the mail these days. In the District of Columbia.
Yep.
Let me ask you again about, while you say voting can be safe, whether by mail or as long as you keep social distancing, even if you're stuck in a long line, the political rallies we talked about. The Minnesota Department of Health now says that 22 people related to Trump-Pence campaign events have tested positive for coronavirus. Should the president stop hosting these rallies?
I can't advise the president about what he can do and should do with regard to political campaigns, but I can reiterate my statement that when you have congregate settings of a lot of people together, closely packed, when most are not wearing masks, that is a risk situation to be avoided.
We saw when the president was just in Florida, which was his first big rally on the road after recovering from coronavirus, we saw thousands of people packed in without masks. We saw the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, walk through the crowds, giving high fives to people. And then you can clearly see in the video him take his hand and wipe his nose. That's concerning for any infectious disease, correct?
It is. That's what's called risk behavior.
And ill-advised.
Yeah, risk behavior by definition is ill-advised.
Says the doctor. Well, Dr. Anthony Fauci, and will you be one of the first to try and get an effective vaccine? Will you believe it is safe? People ask me all the time. Even Gayle King says, would you get a vaccine when it's ready? And I said, absolutely. I trust the NIH. I wonder if you could just say one more thing about the safety of vaccines.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have really a strong confidence in the FDA's career scientist as well as the commissioner who made it very public that he would not let any political considerations go into the decision of making a safe and a vaccine. We have multiple safeguards of committees that are advisory committees that talk about that. If it goes through the process, which I'm sure it will be, of what happens when you get to the point of a safe and effective vaccine declaration, I would feel comfortable in taking a vaccine, and I would feel comfortable in advising you, my friend, to do that.
And do you think children will be getting that vaccine at first?
Yeah, they will, but not right away because of the vulnerability of children, Norah. You always want to see that you have a degree of safety and of efficacy before you start giving it to children because of their extra vulnerability that children have.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, thank you for joining us, and we hope to do this again soon.
Thank you, Norah. It's always good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.